We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Tes Amud Aleph in Meseches Eruvin. This is Eruvin Daf 59a. The Mishnah had said that if you measure the tchumen and one area comes out longer than the other area, you get the longer area. So the Gemara now asks, L'makom sheriba in, you get the longer area, L'makom shemiyet lo, you don't get the shorter area? That doesn't make any sense. Rashi here says, L'makom shemiyet lo bitmiya. It's a question. V'lo yesh bechlal masayim mana. Obviously, if you have the longer tchum, you're going to get the shorter tchum as well. So the Gemara says, Ema af l'makom sheriba. Obviously, what the Mishnah means is even the longer area. You get the longer tchum, of course you get the shorter tchum, you get it longer than the shorter tchum, you even get to extend your tchum. The Mishnah then seemed to repeat itself. It said, Ribo le'echad umiyet le'echad. If one measures longer and one measures shorter, you go by the longer one. So the Gemara says, Asu lamali, hainu hach. What do you need to say anything further for? It's the same thing as before. So the Gemara says, Hachi Kamar, here's what it means. Riba echad umiyet echad. If one person measured a longer tchum than the other person, shomin lozeh sheriba, we listen to the person who had the longer measurement. Amar Abaya said, Uvilvad shelo yarbe yoser mimidas ha'ir balachsona. As long as he doesn't do it longer, as long as the difference is not more than the measurement from the city if you would do it in a diagonal. Rashi over here says, first of all, Hachi Ka'amar Riba echad umiyet echad shemadadum shnei b'nei adam. Two separate people made measurements. Zem miyet v'zeh riba. One did a smaller measurement, one did a larger one. And then Abaya says, as long as shelo yarbe yoser mimidas ha'ir balachsona, it shouldn't be more than the diagonal. Meaning, Ta'afilu riba shir gadol. Even if, let's say, the measurements were way off, one person had a much larger measurement, you can't possibly say that the discrepancy is because of how tight you pulled the rope. Talinan be v'tos halachsan. We do say that it's possible the mistake was made in terms of measuring the diagonal. In other words, did you set the square up right to the directions of the earth? We'll say one of them did it properly. And he did it properly, but he put the area which we call the tchum, the side measurement, he did that for the diagonal. So what he essentially did was, he basically lost the corners. In what should have been the corner and should have been a little longer, he only measured 2,000 amos, because he didn't look at it as a corner, he looked at it at the sides. The corners, you get a little more than 2,000 amos. So he ended up losing that whole extra space. He lost the whole diagonal of 2,000 in the corners. But if there's more of a discrepancy than even that, we have nothing to say what causes this discrepancy. But Rashi says still, even with this pshat, he's not sure about the lashon, he's not sure whether it fits the language. In any case, the Gemara now continues here, quoting the Mishnah, the reason why you're allowed to go by the larger measurements and you can go by the larger tchum is because the Chachamim were not machmir, the Chachamim were mekel. It's a lenient situation. So the Gemara says, Vatanya, what are you talking about? We learned in a Brayso, it says exactly the opposite, that the Chacham are not lenient, they're strict, and here it's saying the Chachamim are lenient. So Amar Ravina answers, Lo lahakil al divrei Torah. What the Brayso means is we're not lenient when it comes to something that is doraisa. Ela lahachmir al divrei Torah. We're being machmir and adding a din derabanan, or tchumen derabanan, but tchum is only derabanan. So within tchumen itself, you can be mekel. Rashi over here says, Lo lahakil al divrei Torah. Kol ma shegazru chachamim b'tchumen lahachmir al divrei Torah bo. The entire concept of tchumen, in a sense, is a chumrah. It's a stringency because you're being stricter than the Torah. It's midoraisa lo mitzri midi, because according to Torah you don't have any yisur at all. V'inu gazer, and they just made this gezer of tchumen. Hilkach, therefore, as linan behula kula, we go with this leniently da tchumen atzman midrabanan, because tchumen itself is only midrabanan. The Gemara now continues with the Mishnah. Ir shel yachid, let's say you had a private city, v'nasis shel ravim, and it became a public city, more people moved into it. Rashi over here explains, Ir shel yachid shelo ayu nichnasin ba Tomid Samech Ribo Shel Bnei Adam. You didn't have 600,000 people entering. V'lo chashiva Rishus Haravim to lo damyu lediglei midbar. It wasn't considered Rishus Haravim because it wasn't similar to the way they traveled in the midbar. Then v'nasis Shel Ravim shenitosu v'adiyorin. More people came in there to live there. O nikvu b'shvakim, or maybe you had marketplaces that were there. So the Mishnah says ma'arvin eskula. You can make an eruv in this entire city. Rashi says ma'arvin eskula kibatchila. You can make an eruv just like you did before. V'ein mevo oseh tzrich and tikun. You don't need to fix anything. Sharehi chatzer achas, it's all considered one chatzer. And Rashi says an important qualification, the case has to be that you don't actually have a real bona fide Rishus Harabim, meaning Doraisa, shall tez zayin amma. There's no street that's actually 16 amas wide. If you did have that, Mefarish Begemara Takanto L'Rishus Harabim Shabasocha. The Gemara will explain how you fix that particular area, which is a Rishus Harabim Doraisa. So that's the first case. Again, you have a private city and it becomes a public city. So in such a situation, you could make an Eruv in the whole thing. Now, V'shel Rab and V'nasa Shel Yachid. What about the reverse? Let's say originally it was a public city, then it became a private city. Ein ma'arvin es kula. You're not allowed to make an Eruv in the entire city. Elam kein asa chutzala ki ir chadasha shabyuda. Unless you leave out what is the size of a new city in Yehuda, sheyesh bo chamishim diurin, meaning an area that has 50 residents. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says you leave aside a little bit less. Gimel chatzeros shel shnei batim. Leave aside 3 chatzeros, which each have 2 houses. So Rashi over here says, V'shel rabim shenasis shel yachid. Again, this is a situation where the public city became the private city, it became smaller. Ribusa Ashminan, and this is a chiddush. Ti'avagav the nasis shel yachid, even though it became so small that it's now shel yachid, it's considered private. Ein ma'arvin eskula, you're still not allowed to make an eruv. Holet chilasa shel rabim, since originally it belonged to the rabbim. The dilma hadra umisavda shel rabim, because maybe it's going to become the rabbims again. V'asu leiruva kula, and then you're going to end up making an eruv in the whole thing. V'asur lo arev ir shel rabim below shiur. And you're not allowed to make a city that's a Rishus Harabim without leaving aside something you can't make in an Eruv. Now, even though you'll say, well, what's the big deal? This is not a Rishus Harabim Gemura. It's not a Rishus Harabim Doraisa. The reason is we just don't want people to forget about the laws of Rishus Harabim. The leaving off is simply a heker, the time of Mishum Eruv. We're just trying to show you have to leave a little bit of this public city off so people should realize that you're making an Eruv, and they realize the concept of Eruv, and that way the concept of Eruv will not be forgotten. Of course, technically, there's nothing wrong. This is not a Rishus Harabim Doraisa. Technically, you could make an Eruv and an Ir Shel Rabim, but we don't want to do that in a situation where, then people are going to forget about the concept of Eruv. Now, before we proceed with the Gemara, we'll just point out what the Ritva says. The Ritva says this concern that Rashi points out in the Seifa of the Mishnah, where you have to leave out a little bit of the city from the Eruv because we're afraid otherwise people will forget about the Torah Rishus Harabim, that only applies in the Seifa of the Mishnah where the city was originally Shel Rabim. But if you have a city which originally was Shel Yachid, and it's known to be a city that's owned by this private individual, even if it became Shel Rabim, we're not afraid people will get confused. People are not going to mix that up with a real Rishus Harabim, so you don't have to leave anything over. So the Gemara now says, Hechi dami ir shel yachid v'nasis shel rabim. What's an example of a private city that becomes a public city? Amar Rav Yehuda says, could go and discard the Reish Galusa, for example, the village of the Reish Galusa. Amar le Rav Nachman, so Rav Nachman said to him, my time, and what's the reason you're giving this example? Mishum shchichi gabe harmina mitkriya hadadi. So maybe you'll say we're giving this example because there's a lot of people that frequent this city for government-related issues. And Rashi says, mitkriya hadadi, delo asur, lemishri shel rabim, v'arei shel rabim. People won't get confused because they'll remind each other that this is an exceptional situation. It was really a private village at first, but the Gemara says you don't need that example. Kulu Yisrael nami b'tzafra deshabsa shchichi gabi hadadi. All of Klal Yisrael on Shabbos morning, they're by each other. They gather together. So you could think of many examples where there are going to be people around to remind each other that there's a difference. Ella, rather, Amar of Nachman says, could go and discard the Dinitzui. It's like the village of Natsui. That's just a person, a particular individual. Rashi says, could go and discard the Dinitzui, Krach Shel Oso Ish. It was a village that belonged to this particular individual, meaning any individual. You don't need to come up with a Reish Galusa. Any private city that then goes on to become a public city, the halacha is you can be ma'ariv the whole city. Gemara now says, Taner Rabbanan, we learned in a Brayso, Ir Shel Yachid v'Nasis Shel Rabim. Again, you have a private city that became a public city. U'Rishus Harabim overes besocha, and you have a real Rishus Harabim, Rashi says, 16 amos wide, that actually goes through the city. So, Keitzad ma'arvin osa, how can you be ma'ariv this area? Osa lechi mikan v'lechi mikan, you can make a lechi on one side of that street, and on the other side of the street, okora mikan v'kora mikan, or make a kora on both sides of the street, v'nosei be'emsa, and then you can carry in the middle of the street. The Brayso continues, you cannot make an Eruv in only half of the city. Ela okula, either make the entire city an Eruv, or mavoi b'fnei atzmo, or you have to make every mavoi by itself with an Eruv independently. And then the Brisa continues, Haisa shel Rabim v'harei shel Rabim. Let's say it was a public city, and it belongs to the public. And Rashi over here explains, again, Rashi says, Rishus Aram overis besocha shel tes zayin amarochav. It's 16 amos wide. Lechi mikan v'lechi mikan. You have a situation of a lechi on both sides. L'rashe Rishus Aram on both sides of Rishus Arabim. Uvayarash ein lem chom askin. And Rashi says we're talking over here where there's no wall around the city. Sherashe Rishus Aram mefulashin, totally open on both sides. So you need to have these lechis on both sides. Uveshel Rabim v'harei shel Rabim. And he says that when you have a situation of a public city that belongs to the public, Lo sharu rabbanan lahatakanta dechol mevoseh hamefulashin have a kerishas haram. They don't allow this takana because in a normal situation you wouldn't allow this because it's all considered open to rishas harabim. Uvo takanta midrabbanan demichlafi b'rishas harabim. You're going to need some kind of takana that you don't get confused with a real rishas harabim. Avol be'ir shel yachid, but when you have an ir shel yachid, like our case over here, you have an ir shel yachid. It's really a private city. Mucha milse. So then it's clear, and you don't need to have any other takanas because we're not afraid that you're going to get mixed up. Again, that's this first case of the Brisa. An Ir Shel Yachid that became an Ir Shel Rabim in such a situation, that's what Rashi's saying. You don't need any extra takanas. You just do the regular lechi on both sides or korah on both sides, and it's not a problem. And then the Brisa said you can't be married. Half of it to Kavan to make chadahi, since originally this was all one city. Asri hani ahani, one side asers the other side. This is going to be explained more in the Gemara in the next Amud. It's similar to a situation where you have a mavoi where one of the chatzeros in the mavoi didn't join up with the eruv or with the shitufei mavos. That ends up asering everything. So the same thing over here. Everyone is interconnected like one, and therefore if you make only half of the city gets an eruv, the other half actually prohibits because it's all considered that they're all traversing into one another's property. Oh, mavoi, or you do each mavoi independently. The Gemara is going to ask, why does it help if you do every mavoi independently? If one answers the other, if that's the situation, it shouldn't help you when you do it independently. And we'll see that discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Tes Amud Beis.